And I'm going to tell you about the oil deception. And I would start out by telling you that, as I always start my radio programs, reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And those words actually, not something I thought of. They were actually said by Larry McDonald, Congressman Larry McDonald, who was on Korean Flight 007 that went down back in 1983. And you know, none of the bodies were ever discovered. And when the plane was finally, the wreckage of the plane was finally found in the ocean off Sakhalin Island, why, of course, there were no bodies there. There was no luggage there. And of course, there are many, many people who believe that Larry is somewhere in a prison, because he was putting out the same message that we're putting out many, many years ago, trying to warn people about what was going on and the fraudulent nature of not only the political process, but of so much of what goes on today. Because most people cannot see reality for what it really is. Reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. Now, an understanding of the forces that shape the events of the 20th century is predicated really not upon facts to be learned, but upon secrets to be discovered. And this morning we're going to deal with many of those secrets. And we're going to be talking to you about the oil deception. We put a lot of material together in the syllabus here, which we bought copies of. And the documentation for much of what I'm saying you will find here. Basically, I'm going to tell you why the price of oil increased, and then why the price of oil fell. But I can't really tell you that story unless I tell you the story of Lindsay Williams, who is a gentleman we've talked to off and on for, well, pretty close to 25 years, and a man I consider as a friend. And then I'll tell you the small part that I played in the Lindsay Williams story, which was recently featured on Alex Jones again, as it has been a number of times in the past. Then I'm going to tell you what I think lies ahead. I'm going to tell you about the spiritual component of what's going on, and then, of course, conclude with the source of our hope. Because we do have hope, unlike most of the people out there who really see what's going on and they wonder what's happening, and people are frightened. And I think people who understand what's going on aren't frightened. Yes, we're going to be in for some very difficult times. But we understand what's going on, and hopefully you will have a better understanding when you leave today. Now, to understand what's going on, I think you really have to realize that almost nothing that we believe is really true. First of all, we might ask the question, why are we fighting in Afghanistan today? Well, most people believe we're fighting in Afghanistan because America was attacked on September 11th, 2001. And as a result of that attack, why America had to make a reprisal. And of course, the attack was arranged by a man named Osama bin Laden, who was living in Afghanistan. And although the Afghans offered to send bin Laden out of the country or send him to another country for trial, that wasn't sufficient. We would not negotiate with him. He had to be immediately handed over, along with all of the leaders of Al-Qaeda, but they didn't say who the leaders of Al-Qaeda were, and our forces immediately attacked. And we've been fighting there now for 7 years. Well, of course, the problem is that we're told that Osama bin Laden escaped into Pakistan. So if we really went into Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden, why didn't we attack Pakistan and capture him? Well, we couldn't do that because it was a sovereign country. Well, if it was a sovereign country and Afghanistan was a sovereign country, why was it all right to attack Afghanistan and continue fighting them for 7 years, where we couldn't attack Pakistan, which was a sovereign country which we were financing? In fact, if you get into the background of what's going on, you'll find out that Pakistan had originally financed Al-Qaeda, had financed the Taliban, and the forces in Pakistan, the ISI, were working very closely with our own CIA. Well, during the intervening years, 7 years, we've given Pakistan about $10 billion, and they finance their ISI. And if you go up on the internet, you find out that the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence unit, is financing the Taliban, who are killing our boys in Afghanistan, and that really doesn't make any sense. But then so much of what goes on today doesn't make any sense. We have a war on drugs. And most of the heroin that is used throughout the world, about 90% of it, is grown in Afghanistan, a country which we totally control. Why don't we just spray the fields there and wipe out the heroin crop? Oh, we couldn't do that, because then the farmers couldn't make a living. Well, here in the United States, why we finance our farmers not to grow crops? Why couldn't we do that in Afghanistan and save the billions of dollars we spend every year in the war on drugs? Or is it that reality is usually scoffed at and illusion is usually king? I would ask the question, why are we fighting in Iraq? We've been fighting in Iraq for 5 years. Well, we went into Iraq because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was threatening to turn those over to Al-Qaeda. But of course, then we found out that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. Well, then it was because Saddam was working with Al-Qaeda, but the thing was that Saddam hated Al-Qaeda because they threatened his rule of the country. Well, then, of course, it was because things were so chaotic in Iraq and we couldn't pull out. We wanted the people to have a democracy. But the reason they were chaotic was because after we had taken control of the country, and this was within about 6 weeks after our attack on Iraq, why Paul Bremer, who of course is a member of what I call the Brotherhood of Darkness, former member of Kissinger and Associates, high-ranking official sent by the president to Iraq to dissolve the Iraqi army, to dissolve the Iraqi police force, to dissolve the Iraqi civil service so there'd be no water or electricity or sewage. And do you know this to this day, 5 years later, why you still only get electricity a few hours a day in Baghdad, although they used to have it 24 hours a day under the wicked Saddam Hussein. And then, of course, Paul Bremer closed down all the factories so people had no jobs to go to. Paul Bremer, of course, closed many of the schools and closed many of the hospitals because there were people there who belonged to the Ba'ath Party. And they created a chaotic situation. But that's why we've had to remain there. Why are we still there? Well, we've negotiated an agreement to leave in 3 years, but the Iraqis don't believe us. They refuse to agree to the agreement. They want us out now. We're saying, look, we're there because we want to help. We'll leave any time that we're asked to leave. So they ask us to leave and we don't leave. And why is that? Reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. Just this last week, while there was a report on the internet that the Iraqi Secret Service, the Iraqi Secret Police, believed that a man named Abu Nidal was an American agent. Now, Abu Nidal, if you go and you look him on the internet, he was one of the greatest terrorists of all time, but he was involved in all sorts of terrorist bombings and killings and murders and all throughout the Near East and the Far East and the Middle East. And yet the Iraqis believed that he was a U.S. covert agent who was committing all of these terrible crimes, these terrible terrorist crimes. If you check out Abu Sayyaf, the Philippine terrorist movement, you'll find out that one of the co-founders of that was a man named Edward Angeles. Edward Angeles, and fortunately we have the internet so you can check all of these things. And Edward Angeles was actually an agent of the Philippine government. The Philippine government created the enemy that they are so avidly fighting today. Here, of course, in the United States, we have the Aryan movement. But if you go into the background of the Aryan movement, at least it was in part financed by our own FBI and intelligence agencies. In Great Britain, they have the Irish Republican Army that was actually bombing and setting off bombs in London. And then we find out, about 2 years ago, that the number 2 man in the IRA was a British agent, a secret British agent. Not only that, but another man who was in charge of security, who tortured many people to death and kill them because he said they were infiltrators into the IRA. He was another British agent. In fact, the hierarchy of the IRA was riddled with British agents. Why would that be? Well, of course, they were creating the best enemy money could buy. Those of you who've studied the history of the Communist Party in the United States will know that the Communist Party had an awful lot of FBI agents in it. I know people who infiltrated the Communist Party for the FBI, certainly the Christian identity movement. Janet Reno warned us against the Christian identity movement. There is a radical movement there, and you've got to be so concerned about it. But then if you study one of their local organizations that was called Elohim City, and I hope that you'll make notes on your little books and look these things up on the internet. At Elohim City, the man who ran this radical movement at Elohim City was a man named Reverend Millar, who was an FBI informant. And then, of course, there was a man named ANWR Strassmeyer there teaching people in military techniques and explosives, and he worked for another branch of our government. Then there was Carol Howe, who was a BATF, Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms informant. And then there was a man named Dennis Mahan, who many believe was also a government informant. In fact, the whole hierarchy of Elohim City were working for one or another branches of our own government. You're going to be hearing this next week or two about the trial of the Fort Dix Six. And this is a group of young, very, very foolish Muslim men who, many of them came from the same family, who are going to stand trial because they were planning on an attack on Fort Dix. They were going to rush in with their guns and start shooting American soldiers and then disappear. But there were really only 5 people on trial in the Fort Dix Six, because actually there were 7 people, and 2 of them were FBI agent provocateurs who put these ideas in the minds of these foolish, young Muslim people and egged them on to make stupid and foolish statements and get themselves video recorded. And the same thing has happened with almost every case of terrorism that has gone to trial here in the United States. In fact, on many of the trials, why the government has lost the case, because it was agent provocateurs who created the whole myth of the terrorist movement. Not that there aren't some foolish Muslim people, not that there aren't some Muslim people who hate America. But then, of course, when we see that many of the people from Guantanamo were taken there and tortured, and they were totally innocent. And a number of them then, when they released, actually went back in the battle and joined the forces, the terrorist forces in other countries fighting America. Can you understand why they would do that if they were innocent and had been tortured? I mean, how would you feel if you were tortured by a country and then, of course, were released? Would you try to strike out against them? We could go into the background of the Ku Klux Klan in America. Certainly the man who published my first book, AIDS, The Unnecessary Epidemic, was actually infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan for the FBI. And of course, we have informants in the United States today. In fact, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, I was recruited to become an informant simply to go to cocktail parties. As a young doctor, I was invited out. That was before I became a conservative and joined the conservative movement. After that, I never got invited to cocktail parties. But all I was supposed to do was go to the meetings and then write down what I heard and what people said and send those reports in on a regular basis to someone in Washington, D.C. We hear about the mafia, the threat of the mafia. But you know the mafia has worked with the Central Intelligence Agencies carrying out assassinations for years now. That sounds incredible. There's a wonderful book, and you can get it on Amazon. It's called Double Cross. And it was written by a man named Chuck Giancano, who was the brother of Sam Giancano, who was the head of the mafia in Chicago, who worked very closely with the CIA, who trusted the CIA because they helped him as far as his distribution of drugs. And do you know that the CIA double-crossed him and had him killed? I mean, you just can't trust anybody this day and age.